What's up, everybody? Corey Hughes, Bloody History. So, we're going to continue on this theme of Mexico City. Now, to preface Mexico City as a whole, Oswald never went there. Kerry Thornley went there 3 times, including the times he was identified as Oswald. Okay. Then you have the Mexico City station, who was supposed to be photographing every person coming and going out of the Cuban consulate, but did they? No. Of course not. They don't have a single photograph of Oswald. They don't have a single photograph of Kerry Thornley either. All they presented was a photograph of Saw Sage. We spent a couple days going over Ann Goodpasture's testimony and her background, and she was the right-hand man of Win Scott. Today what we're going to cover the deposition of the number 2 guy in Mexico City, whose name was consistently redacted from that last interview we did. And that's a man by the name of Alan B. White. Special thanks to Ergo for finding this. Once again, he's going to be interviewed by Michael Goldsmith. All right, so we'll get started. Please state your name and occupation for the record. My name is Alan B. White. I am presently involved in real estate. In what state did you live, or do you live, Mr. White? In Virginia. Are you here voluntarily today without subpoena? Yes. Have you received a copy of the committee rules and supporting resolution? I have. Have you had a chance to read committee rule number 4? Yes. Do you understand that rule? Yes. Do you understand you have a right to counsel? I do. Do you waive that right? I do. Mr. White, under the committee rules, the witness has a right to receive a copy of the deposition transcript. However, by virtue of the arrangement that the committee has worked out with Central Intelligence Agency, in situations where we are interviewing present or former agency employees, I've been requested to ask those witnesses to waive the right actually to receive a copy of the deposition statement. The waiver only goes to the right to receive a copy. We would naturally give you full access to review the copy and eventually sign it and verify it. That would be my only concern. Are you willing to waive the right to receive a copy? To have it? Yes. Are you content to simply review it and evaluate it for accuracy? Yes. Have you had a chance to read the letter which is labeled JFK Document 96837? Yes. Let the record note the correspondence with JFK Exhibit 94 used at committee hearings, a letter from acting DCIA to the chairman of the committee. Do you understand that letter? Yes, I do. The mandate of this committee is to investigate the assassination of the president, to determine whether or not there was a conspiracy, to evaluate performance of the investigative agencies, including the Bureau, the CIA, and finally to evaluate the performance of the Warren Commission. Do you understand that? Yes. Have you had any discussion with any present or former agency employees in reference to testimony that they may have given before this committee? No. Have you had any discussion or contact with the agency in reference to the testimony you're going to give today? Only as to my legal rights, not as to substance. Mr. White, where were you employed in 63? As of June of 63, I was deputy chief of the CIA station in Mexico City. How many years were you employed with the CIA overall? From August 46 until July 31st, 76. I did not catch the first date. August of what year? 46. For the record, I will state I am counsel for the committee, and I am... Hold on a second. Note, there was no CIA in 46. There was no OSS in 46 either, so I don't know who the fuck hired him. Probably got hired at the State Department. Or maybe he was military. That's probably more likely. What were your responsibilities as deputy chief of station in Mexico City? My responsibilities were whatever the chief of station decided to have me do. I would like to be more specific than that, but it was very peculiar relationship. I honestly cannot be more specific than that. I was required to keep myself up to date to the extent I was permitted on everything that was going on. Did your work involve actually contact with agents? Yes, it did. Did your work involve contact with the various surveillance operations the agency had? No direct, not direct, only through staff personnel who were directly involved in it. Were you aware of the nature of the surveillance operations that were in effect? Yes, I was. Who was the station chief in Mexico City? Winston Scott. Can you give your evaluation as to his competence as station chief? He'd been there for 13 years. He knew and was known by anybody who was of any importance in Mexico. He was left there by the director for that length of time. I assume he was thought to be highly competent. What about the nature of the files maintained by the Mexico City station? Were they thorough? They were incredible. They were exhaustive and duplicative in every conceivable way. When you were in Mexico City, did you know Herbert Manel? I did. What was his responsibility? He was the chief of Soviet operations section at that station. All right, guys, let's pull everything on Herbert Manel, Manell. What about David Phillips? David Phillips was chief of the CA section, covert action section. Did Mr. Phillips work at any time in charge of the Cuban operations? In the latter part of his tour, he was in charge of Cuban operations. Did you know Bob Shaw? Yes. What was his responsibility? He was chief of the Cuban operations as well, subsequent to David Phillips' departure. Did you know Ann Goodpaster? I did. What were her responsibilities? She was a special assistant to Win Scott, and her main responsibilities were to handle the surveillance operations. By surveillance operations, do you mean both the wiretap and the photo surveillance operations? Yes, I do. Principally the wiretaps, however, she did not have normal regular contact with the people in the photo operation. That was handled out of the Soviet section. When you say that she had responsibility for the wiretap operation, was that for both the operations against the Cuban and Soviet embassies? Yes. That responsibility was shared, however. She dealt with the outside contract agent who worked with the Mexican security representatives who were actually manning the phone taps. I have a document here which is referred to as CIA document number 170, which was prepared by Ann Goodpaster. I'd like to have you look at it where it says Unilateral Photo Soviets. It lists Ann Goodpaster, alternate CO, and internal routing. Does that in any way help you to remember what her responsibilities were with regard to the photo operation? I didn't arrive until June of 1963. I don't understand what this was. What was the purpose of these names? Apparently, Ms. Goodpaster was asked to compile a list of people in the Mexico City station and their responsibilities. What you're looking at is this list. I knew none of these people. If I knew them at all, I knew them by cryptonyms or transcribers. Please don't concern yourself with the other individuals. Okay, a list of unilateral photos, Soviets. Do you know what Ms. Goodpaster's responsibilities were with regard to the photo operations? As near as I can recollect, she picked up the film periodically from the agent who manned the photo. Was that Sam Bernardi? No, he was a station technician. There was an automatic camera set up across the street from the entrance to the Soviet embassy. We had agents living in there whom I knew only by cryptonym. I'm not sure whether she met those people directly or whether Bob Bernardi, who had been the station technician and then resigned in Mexico, who lived with his Mexican wife there, may have done the direct picking up and then pass them to her. What about Thomas Keenan? Do you know what his responsibilities were? Tom Keenan mainly handled the outside surveillance team. That was his principal responsibility. He did help Annie with some of the pickup. To what degree, I really don't know. But his main responsibility was running the unilateral surveillance team. That was the unilateral surveillance team with regard to the photographs. No, it was for everything. It may have included photographs. This was a physical surveillance team. Yes, for the record, I should say this is consistent with the document which Ms. Goodpaster prepared. CIA number 170 lists Mr. Thomas Keenan as being both with the unilateral taps and with the unilateral photo surveillance. How many different types of wiretap operations were in effect in 1963? Types? My understanding is that there was a unilateral operation and a liaison operation. That's right. Was there any other operation? Not telephone, to the best of my knowledge. What phones did you focus on in regards to the unilateral operation? The unilateral operations were, they changed all the time. The only one who determined what they would be was Win Scott. I have to say again, to the best of my recollection, the unilateral taps were those that we felt we could not discreetly ask the Mexicans to do. The liaison operation was one that you did jointly with the Mexicans? Yes. Turning to the liaison operation against a Soviet compound, do you recall how many phones were being tapped? You're only concerned with the Soviet target now? Yes, we'll get to Cuban later. I honestly don't know the numbers. What about the Cuban operation? I can't give you numbers there either. Could you give me some sort of an estimate? My recollection is that there was a total of 30 lines at any one time, and that half of those were given to the Mexican government and the other half were reserved to us. The ones that were reserved to us, the product was shared with the Mexicans on almost all of them. I think where it wasn't shared was because the Mexicans didn't want to receive it. I can't put my hands in the fire for the fact that all the Soviet or all the Cuban targets were on the joint tap. I think some of them may have been on the unilateral tap, so I would have to say that there were probably more than, the embassy itself. The embassy phones were clearly joint. Where home phones were tapped, there may have been some unilateral, some phones that we kept only for ourselves. There were because anything that was on the unilateral system we did not share with the Mexicans. I'm trying to think how many. Specific liaison taps against the Cuban targets? It is a guess, 3 or 4 maximum. Would you read CIA number 160 through the end of the paragraph at the top of the page of CIA starting number 162 where it says liaison coverage? May I ask what this document is? Certainly, this is an excerpt from the Inspector General's report of 1977. All right. My first question is, does that refresh your memory in any way as to the number of phones at the Cuban embassy that were being electronically tapped? I see it says 5. I would not have any recollection of that because when we got the transcripts, we just got them in a batch and I never paid any attention to what came from what phone. The mechanics of this thing were not part of my responsibility. I want you to understand I was not questioning the accuracy of your earlier answer. I got the 30 right anyway. Yes, you did. I was not making any representation as to accuracy of this particular document. I can't fault any part of it as far as I can see. There are a couple of subjective remarks about the Mexican officers about being brutal and corrupt, but you can say that about a lot of Mexicans. This paragraph here in the CIA, number 161, says that in mid-1962, the Mexican officer in charge of the LI envoy asked the American officer at LI Envoy listening post for the telephone numbers of the Cuban and satellite embassies in anticipation of possible coverage. The station immediately disconnected all the unilateral telephone taps on these embassies so that they would not be discovered when the Mexicans hooked up their taps. I'm sure you understand that. Prior to mid-62 was the liaison operation such that both Mexican and Americans were jointly tapping the Soviet, Cuban, and satellite embassies. The implication here is that the Mexicans were not but wanted to. You see, this thing did not get started until apparently, according to this, until mid-58. There are a lot of mechanical type bugs to work out on an operation of that sort before it begins to function properly. So I have no reason to believe that the Mexicans were tapping. It was before my time there, so I was only dimly aware of what we had been doing against the Soviets and satellites at that time. The succession of events would have been logical because we kept our unilateral taps away from the Mexicans at all times. What would the station have been working on jointly with the Mexicans prior to 1962? Probably communists. Individual persons? Yes. As opposed to the embassy compound? Yes. What happened to the transcript that were made of the conversations that were the subject of electronic surveillance? The transcripts came in several days after the conversation took place. As I recall, we got either the following morning or the next morning. The morning after the conversation took place or 2 mornings later, we got a summary of what had been said depending upon the interest, and that summary was routed to specific officers in the station. Not everybody saw everything. As far as I know, other than the people who processed material like Ann Goodpaster and maybe, in her absence, Tom Keenan, the people who saw it were section chiefs and myself and, of course, the station chief. Anybody who wanted anything out further would mark the passage, send a note to Annie, or go to her with it and say, get a complete transcription of this conversation. I always found the summaries ample for my purposes, since I was not working in detail with any operational targets. Since I had kind of oversee all the operations in the station, it was seldom that myself asked to go back for something. So to answer your question with regards to transcripts, what was done with them, I can only say that if they were in Russian, they would have to go back to Boris and get him to run a complete transcription. Or if they were in some other language, we had a Polish Czechoslovakian to break it down. It would take a few days from the time the conversation came in till the transcript came to the station. Yes. Was Ann Goodpaster the person who brought the transcript to the station? I think so. The reason I'm hesitating is because I keep thinking that's somebody out of the Soviet section. I think it was Herb Manel's wife who was handling it, going back and forth with Tarasov. Was Ann Goodpaster acting in a supervisory capacity with regard to the liaison operations? That's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to say. She carried with her a lot of invisible authority that devolved upon her because of her operational relationship with the chief of station, who had absolute confidence in her. She had a marvelous memory. She was meticulous in detail. I think he had every reason to put that kind of trust in her. She reported directly to him, while she may not have been invested with any command authority by virtue of her position at the station. Certainly, she was a kind of unofficial deputy for the purposes of the operations that she was involved in. For example, we had this old ex-FBI guy on the outside who worked with the Mexicans with the taps. When Ann spoke to Redacted and said something to him, George knew damn well it had the backing of the chief of station. If he didn't, he couldn't go around. He could go around and check it out. By and large, there wasn't much question in George's mind that when Annie said, this boss wants this, that it came from Wynn. To that extent, she had his supervisory responsibility. It was more of an unofficial type responsibility. Yes, she was not in the hierarchy. Let me put it that way. Does that make it clear? Yes. Okay, when the transcripts came into who would be the first person that they would send to? Scott. Then Scott would route them to the respective sections. Yes. They came in 2 or 3 copies, I believe. She would send them directly to him and would underline them for indexing. It did not matter how many times the name appeared. It was underlined for indexing. That is why we had a room the size of a building for a card file. Anyway, the other copy was then routed around to me and to various section chiefs. After you people had reviewed these copies, the transcripts would be stored? Yes. At the Mexico City station? Yes. Would the transcripts be sent to headquarters? When you're talking transcripts, I'm talking summaries. We seldom saw transcripts. When I say I seldom saw transcripts. I know some of the section chiefs did. People working on the Soviet target would call for transcripts occasionally, and I have seen them from time to time, but usually they were asked for in order to get the flavor of the total conversation or in order to attempt to see if there was any substance to something that the summary had alluded to. More often than not, they were then either filed or destroyed. If they were thought to be of significance, they were sent home to Washington. My feeling is that by and large, we did not clutter up the mails back to Washington with a lot of the detailed transcriptions. Were most of the transcriptions summarized and stored in Mexico City? The summaries were, yes. What about the transcripts? Do you know about them? No, I would have to defer to each section chief on that. Do you know whether there was any coordination between the wiretap operation and the photo surveillance operation? So if that, for example, if one of the persons monitoring the wiretaps came across an interesting conversation, he could in some way apprise the photo surveillance people that a particular individual might be coming to the embassy. To the best of my knowledge, it was not. The wiretap operation was conducted by a Mexican and the photo surveillance was conducted by a unilateral operation. Anything coming from the tap operation would have to come back from the station, and any directions would then have to go out. I'm not suggesting that would have been direct contact between the two. Coordination certainly at the station end. So the wiretap people would contact someone at the station whose responsibility it was to be in contact with some of the photo surveillance people. Well, they didn't have to because the wiretap people themselves were mechanics. All they did was process the stuff. Now, that is not to say that maybe a conversation of interest wasn't flagged from time to time. In the main, the interpretation of what was said was the job of the case officer surrounding the station, who would then coordinate on directions to the photographer. By and large, the camera was pretty much automatic. The principal thing they would have to do would be maybe to pick up more often than usual if they were interested in a visit that was signaled in a telephone conversation. You're saying that there wasn't any procedure for the persons manning the liaison operation if they came across a conversation that was of particular significance. You're saying it was not a procedure for them immediately to contact someone at the station to apprise the photo surveillance people of the fact that someone of interest might be coming. No, I couldn't say that because that would be saying more than I know. I don't know that there was or was not. I assume there were means of emergency contact, but I never got involved in that. Did the people at the wiretap operation even know there was photo surveillance operation? Not to the best of my knowledge. Not to the best of my knowledge. They certainly shouldn't have. Do you know whether at the time of the assassination, the Mexico City station had a tape recording of Oswald's voice? At the time of the assassination? Yes, I do not. You don't know one way or the other. I do not know. I tell you my problem, frankly, is one I've always had a problem with, is remembering things in the sequence that they occurred. Do you know if the station ever had a tape recording of Oswald's voice? There was a conversation that was picked up. I don't remember which tap it was now. I guess it was the joint tap, which referred to Oswald. My recollection is that it was him talking to the Soviets and trying to make an appointment with them. We will show you these transcripts later. How long would a tap routinely be retained? The tape themselves, yes. I don't know that there was any routine figure because they were always in need of tapes. There was always a lot of pressure. A lot of these things were voice activated and they were running all the time. The machines were running 24 hours a day, so there was always a great deal of need for tapes. So as soon as they were judged to be no longer needed, they were erased and put back into the center again. I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks maximum, I would say, but that time certainly one would know whether in most cases the conversations were needed or the tapes were needed to back up the transcripts. Do you recall ever listening to tape recordings of Oswald's voice? I do not. Did I ever? My record does not indicate one way or the other. I would like you to look now at CIA number 197, the second paragraph. Yes, sir. This is then the second call. We will go over the transcript later on. Please don't worry about that. I was just trying to understand the paragraph. The question I have with regards to the second paragraph is, does this suggest to you that at the time of the assassination, the station still had one tape recording of Oswald's voice, or that they thought to be Oswald's voice? This one, maybe. You say this one, you're referring to the conversation of September 28th. This whole thing is September 28th. That is right. That is right. I should point out for your information, that was actually the third call that had been attributed to Oswald. I don't know what the second call was. There were a total of 4 calls at least. 4 calls, at least 4 calls anyway. The question I have for you is in regard to the second paragraph. By the way, the paragraph is phrased, does it suggest to you that at the time of the assassination, the station still had the one tape of Oswald's voice? In other words, that particular paragraph does not say at all tapes of Oswald's voice have been erased. All the phone calls with Oswald's voice record came in between September 27th and October 1st. At the time of the assassination, there was still one recording with Oswald's voice on it. Is that your question? Yes. I couldn't get that out of this paragraph. I could not get that out of this paragraph. I don't know who wrote the cable. Ann Goodpaster. I was going to say it sounds like Annie Goodpaster Cable. I would not get that out of that paragraph necessarily. Let's look at CIA number 208. Will you read paragraph 4? That's Tarasov, isn't it? Yes. Does that suggest to you that after the assassination, Tarasov did a voice comparison? Not necessarily, because he was kind of a legend in the station because of his, he had been listening to that tap for so long that he had what officers in the Soviet branch continually told me was a marvelous gift for being able to analyze the voices. He had a fantastic memory for the voices that he heard over those lines, or he heard on those tapes, I should say. It would not surprise me at all that he could say that from memory. Turning now to the photo surveillance operation against the Cuban target, do you know what the scope of the coverage was in terms of time? How many hours per day were they taking pictures of the Cuban target? I don't think I ever knew that. How many years did you work in Mexico City? 4. The usual practice was to start coverage from the time the consulate target being covered opened until the time it closed. I'm not sure about the camera in the Cuban embassy, but in the Soviet embassy I was more than familiar with. Let us talk about the Cuban first, and then we will get to the Russian one. I can't answer the question. I'm not even sure there was a photo operation against the Cuban embassy at that time. What is your best recollection when there was a photo operation against the Cubans? That's right, there was one, but I can't tell you the hours. I'm sorry. What about with regard to the Soviet target? What were the hours of that photo operation? Excuse me. From the time their office opened, which was about 10 o'clock in the morning, until they closed, they varied their closing times from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. Was there a weekend coverage? Normally not. Why not? Because there was no traffic in and out of the embassy. What was the purpose of the photo surveillance operation? By that I mean, what targets were you trying to obtain pictures of? Persons of operational interest who would visit the Soviet embassy, really regardless of nationality. Is it possible that those individuals would visit the embassy on a weekend? It's possible they might have. This decision was made before my arrival down there and was based on a considerable experience of almost total inactivity on weekends. So any weekend coverage would have been pretty unimpressive, I think. Most meetings, I think, were conducted with individual officers either at their homes or meeting places around the city. How thorough was the coverage when the camera was in operation? Allowing for minor outages, as you always suffer in those mechanical operations, it was pretty thorough during the work hours. Do you recall how long it took for the photograph to arrive at the station? In other words, from the time the picture was taken, how many days it would take to arrive at the station? Film, I think, the photographs were processed in the station. I'm not sure. I think it was about every 3 days. It depended on the traffic in the embassy, because when the film was used up, then a meeting would be set up. There were also normal routine pickup types, which I think were twice a week. I'm not sure. Did they ever adopt the practice of sending the film to the station at the end of every working day to cut down on the delay time? I can't say for sure, but it would not surprise me after the assassination if that had been done for a while. But before the assassination, I don't believe so. That could have been arranged at the behest of either the station chief or the chief of facility section. Did the Mexico City station ever obtain the photograph of Oswald? Through that operation? Through any surveillance operation? Not that I know of. Do you know of whether a woman named Charlotte Bustos ever found a photograph of Oswald at CIA headquarters? I know Charlotte Bustos, but I don't know what she was in CIA for. She was up there and I was in Mexico. You never heard a story after the assassination she was looking for a file at headquarters and found a photograph of Oswald that had been taken by the surveillance operation in Mexico City? I never heard that story, no. What would be the procedure for contacting headquarters with information? In other words, how is information communicated to headquarters? By cable or by dispatch? What would be the criterion deciding whether to send something by cable to dispatch? The normal criterion would be the urgency attached to that information, the perishability of the information, not its importance necessarily. The perishability was the criterion. What do you mean by perishability? If it was something that was concerning an event that was going to happen in the next 2 or 3 days, as you do not want to use a medium which was going to take a week to get to Washington, then you would send a cable. Sure. When did the name Lee Harvey Oswald first come to your attention? Obviously during this cables exchange sometime, but I can't give you a date. I can't relate it to a particular date. Was Oswald's contact at the embassies in Mexico City considered to be important? At the time it first occurred, yes. I would have to conclude that it wasn't recognized as anything extraordinary at the time it first occurred. Why do you conclude that? Because if it had been, it would have been pulled out and sent to Washington, either with a complete transcription, a complete excerpt out of the transcription, or the entire tape and transcript would have been sent to Washington by the first available pouch, probably by special courier. Hang on, I'm just pausing for a second because I'm thinking this through here. This is a CIA station in Mexico City. Obviously, they were aware Kerry Thornley went to Mexico City. Obviously, there has to be a relationship between Kerry Thornley and some of these people at this Mexico City station for them to be able to fucking conveniently ignore all the fucking photographs that should have been taken of him. But what's catching my attention here is the fact that he's talking about these cables that were sent regarding Oswald, but they weren't of much significance. They weren't of much importance. Okay. So the very notion that the CIA would send Kerry Thornley to the embassy to make a phone call that they knew was fucking tapped tells me that the phone calls were a staged event. The phone calls were a purely staged event. Had to have been. Had to have been. Let me see. Does the fact that Mexico City station sent to headquarters a cable reporting Oswald's contact suggest that the station considered the contact to be important? I can't remember when the cable was. Let us take a look now. If it was before or the assassination or after, let us take a look at the cable now. All right. Please read CIA number 178. You are asking what is the significance of the cable. Yes. Well, operational, that is all. Her here is an American citizen, at least a man who appeared to be an American citizen, speaking broken Russian, and in contact with the embassy. This is of operational interest. This is the kind of information that we were directed, among others, to get back to Washington because they passed that kind of thing to the Bureau. Were contacts by Americans with the Soviet embassy considered to be unusual? Well, we were in 1963 then. They were considered worthy of note, let me put it that way, of course, from an operational point of view. We were looking for any way we could exploit a contact with the Soviet embassy. Were such contacts by Americans frequent? Not terribly frequent. Not terribly frequent. There were members of the American exile colony in Mexico City who were kind of routine contacts with the Soviets, usually on cultural matters? No, I would say they were relatively infrequent. That is why the cable was sent? Yes. I realize that the cable does not say that this is a photograph of the person mentioned in paragraph 1, but the cable suggests that this may be a photograph of the person mentioned in paragraph 1. Yes. Do you know how the photograph was linked to the person mentioned? By date. It was taken entering the Soviet embassy and leaving on the same date this conversation took place. I remember that proceeding because we were combing through the takes of that day to determine any person who looked like an American an American male. The A is missing. I believe this was the only one. So the first paragraph indicates there was a telephone conversation. Yes. And by virtue of that reference to the telephone conversation, you would have gone to look for the photograph on October 1st. Yes. Did you at that time look through the photograph take from the other days? In other words, before and after October 1st? I didn't. I couldn't say. Were you involved at all in looking for this particular photograph? No, I was involved in looking at it once it had been isolated. You just said you could recall the proceeding where there was a search for the photograph. Yes, I do remember that. And of course, the later events made that time stand out a lot more. Who are the people involved in the review of the photograph take, trying to find the photograph of Oswald? Bear in mind, this is the date of October 8th. This was a perfectly routine, nothing to get excited about on that day. Here's an apparent American. Fine. Now it becomes a little bit of an exercise, a little bit of a game to see if we can match a photograph with that telephone call. That's all it was. I understand. The person involved would have been the analyst, probably the analyst of the Soviet section, of which Herbert Manel's wife was one. Anyone else? I can't remember whether Cynthia Houseman was there at the time. I don't think she was there at the time. I don't think she had come yet. I know she hadn't. Herb and his wife and one young male case officer, that would have been it. Is it your testimony that you think this photograph was selected because on that day, that was the only individual who could be identified as an American? Who appeared to be American. I don't know what time the telephone conversation was, but the time of the telephone conversation may have had something to do with the elimination of other possible Americans appearing on photographs that day. I don't remember whether there were. The timing of the conversation would not have anything to do with really with the time that the persons were at the embassy, especially since the conversation did not say, "I'm coming over." No, the conversation did not say he was coming over, so let us scratch that qualification. Will you take a look at now at CIA number 177, which is the headquarters copy of that cable? I have one question about that document. I am pointing to where someone wrote in D 200-5-41. Do you know what that means? That's the file reference. That is where it was to be filed. To which file does that refer? That is the subject file, 200-5, but I don't know. I never dealt with the Mexico desk files at headquarters, so I don't know how they broke that down. Let us examine some of these transcripts now. Will you please read CIA number 13, which is a transcript of a conversation that took place on October 1st, 63. Okay. When was the first time that you saw this transcript, if you had ever seen it before? I don't know. I really don't know. Do you recall if you saw this transcript before the assassination? I could have, but not necessarily. If I did, it was just part of my routine reading. Some days I had time to read this stuff. Some days I didn't. Do you know whether this transcript was the one which promoted the cable to be sent to headquarters supporting Oswald's contact with the Soviets? That first cable we saw was October 1st? Yes. The cable was dated October 8th, but it was referred to a contact on October 1st. Now, is this cable the transcriber indicates is the same person phoned a day or so ago and spoke in broken Russian? Then the person identified as Oswald says, "I was here last Saturday at your place." Do you recall whether upon reviewing the transcript and checking the photo production take, whether the individuals doing that check went back as far as the preceding Saturday? I would have to assume they did. As I said, I don't think there was any photo coverage on the weekends. Have you found the photo coverage on weekends? Am I wrong about that? I really can't answer that. The committee rules prohibit me from discussing that kind of matter. Now, will you please read CIA number 14 and 15? Okay, what is the question? Have you read 15 also? No. That is the transcript. Okay. Have you ever seen that transcript before? The transcript from the conversation involving Oswald. Although Oswald was not identified by name, it was linked to Oswald, and the date of it is September 28th, 1963. Very likely I have. Do you know when this transcript was linked to Oswald? By that, I mean, do you know if it was linked to Oswald prior to the assassination? I do not know that. No, I wouldn't know it because it wouldn't have any significance in the station before the assassination, except perhaps in an operational context or counterintelligence context when they were trying to find out who this guy was. I have the same question for you in regard to two other transcripts. They appear to be starting on CIA number 16 through the CIA number 18. Please read them. And my question is, have you seen them before? And when were the transcripts linked to Oswald? All right, you asked the same question? Yes. I don't know when that first came to my attention, undoubtedly after the assassination. I would not have formally concerned myself with this in a routine operation. Do you know at that point your subordinates have linked these conversations to Oswald? At what point they would have linked? In other words, prior to the assassination or after the assassination. They were bright people. I assume they would have had Oswald at least as one possibility, and probably the most likely possibility, as being the speaker to whom Sylvia Duran was referring in her conversation with the Soviets, so probably before the assassination. Did you have personal knowledge prior to the assassination that Oswald had been to both the Cuban and Russian embassies? I don't think so, unless I read this conversation, but I just said it would not have registered on me. Let us take a look at CIA number 183. Would you please read that cable? Yes, sir. When would Win Scott have put those marginal notations in? As he read it, probably. Now, turning to the marginal notation on the left where it says SIC and underlines and points to the word Henry, do you know why Win Scott would have written SIC Henry Oswald? If that is what that is it SIC? I don't want to influence you one way or another. We've had testimony previously that is sick. Then it may well be. The term sick is commonly used to point out that there is an error made. It would have had to have been after the assassination or after it became apparent that the person we were all interested in was Lee Harvey Oswald. I say that because it is perfectly logical to me, because Wynn had the files right on his desk every day for the Oswald investigation. This is after the assassination. Yes, after the assassination. He would have been pursuing them continuously. Now, this paragraph contains a more accurate description. I'm pointing to the first paragraph contains a more accurate description of Oswald, does it not? Then what? Then the description contained in the cable October 8th from the Mexico City station to headquarters. Because they were not the same guy. This was Oswald, and the other guy wasn't. Once this cable was received, was the station aware that the person they had referred to in the first cable was in all likelihood not Oswald? I think so. I would think so. I have to repeat again at this point that I'm in time that this guy was nothing other than of a routine counterintelligence interest, you see. I understand. Would you read paragraph 5? I did. All right. So we're about halfway through this, and so we're not going to get through it all today, and so we'll save the second half for tomorrow. The Mexico City stuff is interesting. We're not going to spend a whole lot more time on it. We'll get through this. We'll get through some Win Scott stuff, and then we'll dip out of Mexico City, because Mexico City is really not that interesting. I mean, to be fucking honest, Kerry Thornley went to Mexico City. All the contacts there and everything that people are saying coincide with Kerry Thornley's trips to and from Mexico City in May and in early September, and then later again at the end of September. So, yeah, I mean, it's good to hash all this stuff out. It's good to know all these names, you know. When someone asks you who the deputy chief of the station in Mexico City was in 1963, you can say it was Mr. White, right? So, all right, guys, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my Substack. It's been pretty fucking killer. I'm getting a lot of good feedback on it. And so that's that, guys. I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll wrap this thing up.